тепер наш наступний our next speaker. We are very fortunate today to have the only relatives of Vera here. It's her cousin, Jane Taylor. І я хочу надати вам
Just now a brief interlude of sort of family chit-chat really, a bit of a digression from the very sort of academic and intellectual discussions that have been going on this morning. Well, I'm Vera's cousin. Well, technically, as she told me, I was her first cousin once removed. I always thought I was her second cousin, but no, she told me quite adamantly. The first cousin once removed. Vera was my mother's cousin. And my mother, Peggy, remember that name because you'll hear a little more about it shortly. She became Vera's next of kin when Vera's mother died in 1991. And Peggy was Vera's eldest cousin and 11 years older. And then when my mother was in her 80s and she was getting a little bit too old to kind of deal with the occasional crisis that Vera might present from time to time, I became Vera's next of kin by default. But my family didn't really know Vera. We knew Faith. Faith was always Faith to our family. Some of you, most of you may well know that her real name was Faith Elizabeth Joan. And although I now think about and talk about her as Vera, it wasn't really until the last year of her life when I began to meet people outside of the family who knew her professionally. For example, when I went to Lviv with her in February 2009, that I started to realise that absolutely everyone else knew her as Vera. And over the years since 2009, Faith has become very much Vera to me, as she is to all of you. Her name change had nothing to do with the fact that for virtually all of her life, from the age of about 3, she lived on a street called Vera Avenue. That was just a complete coincidence. But it did provide a rather nice address on postal correspondence, Vera Rich, 99 Vera Avenue, Grange Park, Enfield, North London. Now the reason for her name change was that after she became a frequent visitor to the Beverton Church in Finchley in her later teens, the community there really struggled with the pronunciation of the th sound, which I think maybe we can say it quite easily, but they and maybe some of you couldn't. So her name was changed to the Slavic version of Faith, which is Vera, and it stuck. And as she became more and more involved with the Belarus and Ukrainian communities in London and then in Oxford, and soon began translating poetry and literature from both these countries. Once or twice, her name change caused a bit of a problem. For example, when she couldn't be found and tracked down in hospital, the hunt by Alison to locate her after her operation fell on stony ground. And it wasn't until you realised that her real name was in fact Faith that she was found. So although she was always known to us in the family as Faith, professionally and to all her friends and acquaintances outside of the family, she was definitely Vera and remained so. Vera and her mother Magdalene often visited our home, which was about a mile away from theirs, taking a shortcut as the crow flies across Enfield Golf Club, which was quite a bit less distance than walking along the streets. I don't think there was any public right-of-way or footpath across the golf club, but that didn't deter them. And to me as a child, they always had wondrous stories to tell about their travels and other adventures. They liked to visit the Orkneys and the Shetland Isles, and often in the summer to go to St Maurs in Cornwall. Vera told me that our family were Viking Irish descendants, and Vera and her mother certainly had an affinity with all things Nordic and Celtic. Indeed, Vera studied Old Norse at Oxford University, but then, as we all know, she sort of got hijacked into Slavic languages, which was her focus for the rest of her life. However, she did maintain links with Vikings. There were even a few that Vikings that attended her funeral service at the Ukrainian cathedral. And as another story from Alison goes, as she approached her operation for breast cancer in around about 2006, she requested that should she not survive, a knife be placed in her hand to enable entry into Valhalla, as is the Viking tradition. Alison can expand on that story.
Totally true.
So despite her incredible involvement with Belarus and Ukraine and other Eastern European countries, particularly when she was correspondent for Nature magazine, during her years as a journalist, she still retained an affinity to Viking culture, which was part of her genetic makeup, so she told us, and I must have said as well. I certainly do feel quite at home, stature-wise, when I'm in Scandinavian countries, and certainly not petite Mediterranean types. But really, from the very first experience of Slavic language, Vera was hooked. Just refer a little to, I think it was Carolina referred to a little piece of writing about how she discovered the church at Finchley. But I think just to quote a few words from it, it's quite significant. She attended a Roman Catholic church, and one of the Benedictine monks there was keen for the young people to appreciate that the Catholic did not necessarily mean Latin. I mean, she was very keen and knew a lot of Latin. So he wanted to organise various events to teach us about other rites, as she wrote. I remember being a little disappointed when our priest told us that although the liturgy was the Byzantine rite, it would be in Old Slavonic, not Greek, because I had learned some Greek at school. However, I thought whatever language it is in, it will be interesting. And indeed, to the other young people, found it interesting. But for me, it was the beginning of a new life. And as we've heard just earlier, when I walked into that beautiful little church, I suddenly had a strange feeling that for the first time in my life, I was where I ought to be. So yeah, it was quite interesting to know she went from very much focusing on Latin and Nordic languages to Slavonic languages. Vera's humorous poetry, I'll just touch on that briefly. She wrote quite a number of clever and very funny poems. Some of you will be familiar with them. This had not always been her modus operandi. Her own poetry for many years had been more serious, beautiful worded verses. Her humorous poetry really developed, so she told me, when her elderly mother, Magdalene, was struggling with constant arthritic pain. Vera said that laughing eased her pain, so she wrote these funny poems, primarily, at first anyway, to help ease her mother's discomfort. And she was able to write a clever poem about almost any situation, including, as Alison told me as well, waiting at a bus stop for a very delayed bus to appear. Apparently she had fellow bus passengers singing a few verses of poetry about the bus being late within a very short time. So Vera in her teenage years in the early 1950s, she was quite remarkable through all her life really, of having, by her complete lack of material desire. She was not at all interested in how her surroundings looked, and indeed most of the time how she looked. Her appearance could be, raise a few eyebrows I think, by some of the people who came across her. But those who knew her marvelled at her exceptional genius for so many things: linguistic skills, poetry writing, translation from many Eastern European languages of literature and science, and her amazing ability just to know, in capitals know, about so much, encyclopedic brain, and an ability to find out what she wasn't supposed to know and be the first to do so. She told me that MI6 were quite often miffed that she knew of secret information before they did. And managed to obtain it without having visas to go where she probably did. Vera's sole focus throughout her adult life was to get on with her work, which was exceptionally varied, and not much else mattered. except of course her religious devotion, which was embedded during her childhood and teenage years. I have her diary for the year, this is it, it's in my pocket, for the year 1953, when she was 16, going on 17. There are almost daily references to attending Mass, often at 7 a.m. before school. Interesting was the very first entry on the 1st of January, which says Mass at 10 a.m. That wasn't a school day, it was the 1st of January. And then my receipt for my Virgil Society subscription arrived today. So even at 16, she was, into all sorts of things. And this was a time when many 16-year-olds would have been engrossed in the new rock and roll culture of the early 50s, but not Vera. She was focused on learning all she could about Virgil and saved up her pocket money for a copy of the Aeneid in Latin, which she purchased from a local second-hand bookseller a few months later. On the Saturday, the 3rd of January, she visits Enfield Library and took out a number of books. I'll just go through the list. Iolanthe, Les Mele Dance, The Sceptical Chemist, Physics of the Divining Rod, Women as a Force in History, and The Afterlife of the Poets. At the age of 16, just after Christmas, was quite abundant with rather intellectual choice of reading matter and very diverse, from science, poetry, philosophy, dance and opera. I actually had to Google a few of these because I didn't know about them. But L'Aime de la Dancer was an interesting one. But on that very day, it wasn't all about books and intellect. Vera continues in her diary. In the afternoon, we went to see The Road to Bali, which was very funny. That was a 1952 comedy starring Bing Crosby and Bob Hope. And humour was always evident throughout her life, as I've mentioned before with the poems that she wrote. She also used poems as gifts, and a very special poem, Diamonds Are for Peggy and Keith.
Just bear with me a second.
Which will come up in a minute. Just picture the scene. She wrote it for my parents' diamond wedding anniversary, which is 60 years of being married. Have any of you been on the London Eye? Or seen it? You know, the big pictures. Well, we had a little morning celebration on the day of their anniversary in the London Eye, a sort of champagne and canapes type of breakfast thing. And Vera came along to that, and at one point she went bang, 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 and stood up, and this was her gift to my parents on that very day.
At the moment there is no connection.
So it's a double acrostic, but I also know that that word was being referred to before as, well, that structure has been referred to as with a different word, but I can't repeat it because I'm not sure what it was. But you'll see, I was very fortunate that my parents both had names of 5 letters, so she was able to balance Peggy down one side and Keith, my father's name, down the other side. I'll leave it, you can read it at your leisure. Just one reference, whoops.
I think the connection came back.
Can we get it back? She refers to the diamond, and years since their wedding day, 70 in truth. We were gathered, as she said, kindred and friends. It was family and friends at this little gathering on the London Eye. And she says in the 3rd line, in wartime danger was their love's beginning. My parents met in early 1942 at the ages of 16 and 19. My father had just signed up to go into the RAF, so she was, and they actually met right by the River Thames where they both worked near that location. My father came from South London and my mother was from Enfield, so it was quite opportune to have the wedding anniversary celebration at that spot because they could see exactly where they met. But yeah, she refers very subtly and cleverly to their meeting in 1942, and then goes on to talk about it, and as is often the case, a nice little biblical reference, kind Jesus who to fill a cup, empty too soon, turned water into wine. In this bright hour we thank thee for thy blessing, to them bestowed love constant and unchanging. Holy indeed is such true matrimony. So it's a very precious family poem, very cleverly structured. And as true to form, she said to me, I was up till about 3 o'clock in the morning finishing this off. So it was always a deadline to meet, but Vera sort of came to life, even more so than usual. So anyway, thank you very much.
Oh,